Open Source by Sean McLaughlin. So this is an overview of my presentation. I'm going to go over what is open source software, history of OSS, open source initiative, uses of OSS for everyday users, and OSS in business and education. So to start off, what is open source software? Open source software is software that can be freely used, changed, and shared in modified or unmodified form by anyone. It's software that's made and shared by many people. It's distributed under. So the criteria for open source software is as follows. First, there can't be any intentional secrets. This means that the software can't withhold any details necessary for interoperable implementation. The software must also have a process for fixing problems and implementing those changes into an updated version. Next is availability. This means that the software must be freely and publicly available from a stable website under royalty-free terms at a reasonable and non-discriminatory cost. Next, the software must also have patents. These patents necessary must be licensed under royalty-free terms for unrestricted use or be covered by a promise, if non-assertion when practiced by an open source software. There can be no agreements, meaning that there can't be any requirement for execution of a license agreement, NDA, grant, click-through, or any other form of paperwork used to use conforming changes to the software. Finally, there can't be any OSR or open standards requirement incompatible dependencies. This means that the implementation of the software can't require any other technology that it doesn't meet the criteria of this requirement. Here's a brief history of open source software. In 1983, Richard Stallman from MIT launched the GNU project. The GNU project wrote a complete operating system free from constraints on use of its source code. Users were able to freely run the software, share it, study it, and modify it. The GNU Manifesto was later written by Richard Stallman to gain support for the GNU project. It identified the freedom essential to free software users. Stallman also created the GNU General Public License. This allowed software for the future generation of code derived from it to remain free for public use. In 1991, Linus Torvalds released the Linux kernel. A year later, he relicensed it under the GNU General Public License, making it the first complete free software operating system. The Linux kernel has been modified into many different versions, so referring to all of these versions collectively as Linux is a large generalization. The Free Software Foundation advocate the use of the term GNU/Linux for the whole operating system. Then in the late 1990s, when many website-based companies started up, the use of free software became very popular. The Apache HTTP server, a software that uses the Linux kernel, became the most used web server software. In 1998, Netscape Communication Corporation released the Netscape Communicator suite as a free software. This code is the basis of Mozilla Firefox. This was when the term open software began to be used by people in the free software movement. Later that year, Open Source Initiative was formed. The OSI is a non-profit organization dedicated. Inspired by Netscape, Bruce Perens and Eric S. Raymond founded the Open Source Initiative. Their mission statement is as follows. The OSI is a non-profit corporation with global scale formed to educate about and advocate for the benefits of open source and to build bridges among different constituencies in the open source community. OSI first adopted the open source definition, which lays out the criteria for software to be certified as open source, and they continue to use this to this day. PC users often use open source software without even realizing it. Open source software accounts for most of the software we use as everyday PC users. Many web browsers use OSS. Chrome is the leading browser, which is based off the source code from Chromium. Firefox is also a leading browser that is open source based. Web servers that use open source software include Apache's HTTP server and Tomcat, a web application server. Over 50% of websites rely on Apache's open source web server. Next, obviously, web security is a huge concern in a culture where we see a lot of hacking and identity theft. OpenSSL, licensed under the Apache source code, is the leading security software based on open source. OpenSSL is an open source implementation of the transport layer security and secure socket layers. These allow us to communicate securely over a network. Databases software let us create databases and manage the information stored in them. A large number of websites rely on these databases, so database management has become a very important field. Specialists in this field are highly sought after when hiring developers. MySQL and Oracle database are the most commonly used databases. When it comes to OSS operating systems, Linux is by far the most popular. And while everyday PC users might not use something like Linux Ubuntu as their main operating system, next is open source software in business. A recent survey has found that 78% of businesses use open source software, and 2/3 are building software for their customers that is OSS based. Businesses are attracted to open source software for the many benefits they offer. Open source software requires a lower cost of ownership and gives businesses the ability to enhance their return on investments. OSS in business. A recent survey has found that 78% of businesses use open source software, and 2/3 are building software for their customers that is OSS based. Businesses are attracted to open source software. Next is open source software in education. There are a lot of benefits for using OSS in education. Most open source operating systems are low cost or free for educational use. They come with a variety of useful tools and user applications. Another benefit of a student using open source software like Linux will have a long-term impact on their growth in other areas. If students are exposed to Linux and become comfortable with it, the transition into a workforce that also uses OSS will be much easier. The use of a wide variety of open source software products allows students a greater understanding of the concepts behind their tasks. Since not every student has access to high-end computer software at home, open source software lowers costs and relieves some financial burdens. OSS can also be customized, modified, and updated. This means that educators don't have to buy the latest software and hardware upgrades that they normally would have to buy. And finally, open source software is compatible with older hardware, allowing for greater access to these software.